Sit still. Sit still, darling. Stay quiet. This phrase, whispered in her ear by her mother, was no surprise to Veronica. Their family repeated the mantra so often that it had begun to feel like their family crest. Sit still. Stay quiet. Every night as dark fell, without fail, her mother would come in, tuck the blankets around her, whisper it in her ear. Veronica was the only one left to hear it now. Her mother's footsteps echoed in the cold air of the room, the sound bouncing off of the walls, then fading into silence as she left. Veronica sat still and quiet. Her eyes roamed her bedroom, the last fading rays of the sun illuminating the walls in a pale glow. That light would be replaced with moonlight soon. Her eyes followed a ray to where it shone on a photograph framed on her bedside table. Veronica didn't remember taking the photograph. She'd been too young at the time, barely 1 year old, a chubby baby held in her oldest sister's arms. There were 7 of them, including herself in the photograph. 7 sisters, perfectly dolled up, blonde hair curled, and smiles plastered on their faces. Veronica kept this photograph close to remind herself of her family. Her memory of her sisters was limited. She knew their faces from the pictures. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers of their voices coming from the walls. She would wake up in a sweat, sure that someone had called her name. But it couldn't be. Her sisters were gone. Married, her mother said. They had all found handsome men to marry and were starting their own families. Veronica had asked why they never visited. Once, years ago, her mother's face had become drawn and closed off, age lines appearing in her face, making her look decades older than she was. She'd never received an answer, and Veronica had never asked again. She remembered Rachel more vividly than the others. Rachel was 2 years ahead of her in age, but her mother joked that the 2 of them might as well be twins. They were so inseparable. Rachel had been gone for 3 years now. She was 16 when she left. Veronica was now 17. Veronica remembered the last night she had seen Rachel. The 2 girls liked to sleep in the same room so that they could giggle and whisper together until their mother called for stillness and quiet. That night, their mother insisted that Veronica sleep in her own room. Veronica hadn't listened, sneaking out into the hallway with quiet, bare feet, tiptoeing around all the boards that she knew would squeak. The hallway was dark. She had heard a scuttling behind her, the sound of nails scraping on old wood. But when she looked behind her, there was nothing there. She had quickened her pace, breath coming in short gasps, fear sitting in her stomach like ice. She eased open the door to Rachel's room. The older girl was sitting, still and quiet, in her bed. She glanced at Veronica when she entered and broke out into a relieved smile. Veronica crept to her bed and climbed under the covers. Rachel shifted close to her. She was cold, and the touch of her hand made Veronica jump. I heard something in the hall. Veronica's eyes were wide as she recounted the experience. Rachel's eyes widened as she listened. I'm scared, Ronnie, her sister admitted. The two girls clutched their hands together. The door swung open and they shrieked. Their mother was standing in the doorway, hair frizzled and eyes wild with terror. She stormed to the bed and dragged Veronica out without a word. Rachel reached for her sister's hand, but it was just out of her grasp. The last glimpse Veronica got of Rachel was her sitting upright in bed, hair mussed, frozen in terror. Her mother dragged her back into her room, nearly sprinting through the hallway, looking back and forth as if on alert for someone or something. She flung Veronica onto her bed, then leaned close to her, bony hands clutching her wrist. Sit still. Stay quiet. Her voice came in a hiss, making Veronica shiver. She nodded. Her mother marched out of the room and locked the door behind her. Later that same night, Veronica awoke from a restless sleep to the sound of scuttling near her door. The same sound she had heard in the hallway. She swallowed hard around a lump in her throat. Her heart was beating rapidly. The scuttling got louder and closer until a single nail scraped down her door. Veronica wanted to scream, but her mother's training beaten into her from her first memory kept her mouth closed. Sit still. Stay quiet. Another scrape. Then she heard footsteps approaching and a hushed voice. Not her. Not yet. It isn't her time. Her mother's voice spoke softly outside. Veronica listened, eyes wide. There was a hissing noise in response that chilled her to the bone. There was movement, and Veronica braced herself, expecting to see her door creak open. Instead, the scuttling grew quieter, whatever was outside her door, moving away. The tension in her body failed to release, and Veronica was up all night, eyes red-rimmed and dry. Rachel had been gone the next morning. Her mother said she had moved away to be with her boyfriend. She expected a wedding soon, she said. Veronica had never heard Rachel mention a boyfriend before, but stayed quiet. She never asked her mother about that night, about what had happened in the hallway. She did her best to put it out of her mind. But this night was different. She couldn't help but dwell on the memory of her sister, on the fleeting glimpses of the older ones. She was 17 now. Julia, the eldest daughter, had left when she was 17. At least, that's what her mother had told her. Veronica wondered when her turn would come. Meet a nice boy, start her own family. Maybe she could see them all again when she left. It was a nice thought. Veronica fell asleep to the dream of reuniting with her sisters, meeting their families, reminiscing on their childhood. In her mind, she and Rachel were just as inseparable as they had been for all those years. Rachel turned to her and smiled. When she opened her mouth to speak, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was the hissing that Veronica had heard the night that Rachel had left. She shot up in bed in a cold sweat. She pushed her damp hair back from her forehead, eyes darting around the room frantically. All seemed normal, or as normal as one can see after waking up from a nightmare. To Veronica, all the shadows in her room seemed to come alive, dancing on the walls in a jerky fashion, as if they were puppets. She tried to calm her breathing. Sit still. Stay quiet. The moonlight illuminated the photograph, Rachel's face standing out. Just as her heart rate returned to normal, a voice whispered in the dark, "Ronnie." Veronica's eyes sprang open, pupils dilated. "Ronnie." The voice called again. All of Veronica's instincts, all of her mother's lessons screamed at her to stay in bed, not to respond. But her curiosity, her yearning to see her sister again, won over. She slowly sat up. "Rachel?" she whispered. "Ronnie." The voice was like a cool breeze flowing through her room, leading to the door. Veronica stood up, padding quietly across the floor. Her hand hesitated over the doorknob momentarily, then turned it, as if in a trance. The hallway was dark, and the floor was cold beneath her feet. She swung her head back and forth. A small bit of moonlight came from the window in her room, but she could only see a few inches in front of herself. "Rachel, where are you?" she hissed. The darkness seemed to swallow her voice. Then she heard them. Nails dragging on wood. She stiffened, a chill running down her spine. The scuttling was all around her, and the door to her room swung shut with a click. She gasped and tried to turn the handle, but it was locked. The scuttling came closer and closer, and her vision adjusted. The shadows morphed into figures, and Veronica swallowed a scream. They were too tall, too slender to be human. Their eyes were darker than black, and their teeth glinted as they smiled. Paralyzed in fear, all Veronica could do was stare. As they came closer, some walking, some clinging to the walls, some crawling on the ceiling, she looked closer. There were 6 of them. "No," Veronica breathed out. It couldn't be. One dropped from the ceiling directly in front of her, a demented smile on its face. "Ronnie." The creature did not speak with its mouth, but Veronica knew instantly who it was. Her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes darted from creature to creature. Julia, Mary, Cassandra, Jess, Katie, Rachel. There was no mistaking them. A scream bubbled in her throat, and as they closed in, she finally released it, voice echoing throughout the halls of the house. She got her reunion with her sisters, after all.